So I want to review the episode, The Story of Catcher Freeman of the Boondocks. And definitely this is a very, very interesting episode. And there's a lot of different themes in this. And I do also will say that, like once again, it is kind of a hard story to believe because obviously Robert retells it and then you kind of clearly see how he's either somebody with dementia or somebody who's a habitual liar. And I also think that there's many themes in this episode, especially with how that sometimes, when people think of their ancestors, we have a delusion of grandeur of who they are because we want to be almost like we want to have like the largest sense of pride. And sometimes when it comes to African Americans, it's a little defeating to look at your ancestors because a lot of times, like the big story with a lot of black people is that their ancestors were slaves or they suffered through Jim Crow. So there's always like very, very depressing things. So sometimes when you have that one ancestor that's actually attached to something positive or revolutionary, you're actually, very, very proud of that. And also it's a little defeating too because before DNA and Me and before a lot of technology now, like this episode of the Boondocks was in the mid 2000s. There were a lot of like African tribes and other things like that where people did not know that they had roots from. So it is kind of very painful for some people that they really don't know their heritage and they want to know their heritage. And I will kind of say that, like the episode starts with Granddad telling the story of Catcher Freeman, and his recollection is that Catcher Freeman is a person who led like a slave rebellion, and his goal was ultimately to just free slaves and be like this badass character. And Uncle Ruckus's version is that Catcher Freeman was actually like this was Catch A Freeman was actually like this slave that was that behaved like a dog, just to go down to those racial stereotypes that blacks are inhumane or blacks have no intelligence. And then you also have like this really funny image of slavery being like, water balloon fights, watermelon martinis were served. Black people were in very good fashion and they're very, very unappreciative. And obviously that's completely inaccurate, but it kind of is just to like how Uncle Ruckus has the stereotypes of black people being ungrateful and lazy and white people always being in the right, that it is comical how he comes up with this completely inaccurate vision. And I also think it kind of goes down to like what we kind of see in public schools and other things like that, where I remember like hearing a story that there was a public school saying that African Americans were never slaves, they were indentured servants. And there are some people who are taught that the Holocaust never happened. There are some people, like I remember like my dad getting angry because he read like a textbook that I had in high school that said that Jesus Christ was a carpenter. And so, there are just like either things that are conflicting or there's blatantly things that are not true. And I also remember like, I had a friend who took an AP class, and what happened was that his teacher said, okay, can you please research the authors of your textbooks? Everybody researched the authors of their textbooks. And some people found out that actually the author of their textbook was somebody who was a former member of the Ku Klux Klan. So, it's like what he was saying that, sometimes the author and the writer of history will be around a certain level of bias. And I also think that you see it in two different ways. You see like the bias of Uncle Ruckus being that all blacks are inferior. He kind of represents like, schools having textbooks written by racists, how schools like will like downplay things like slavery. Especially with that controversy I was telling you about, like where some books were saying, blacks were never slaves, they were indentured servants. And then also there's some store talk that I've heard the past like 10 years where they actually want to remove black slavery because they're saying, okay, well, it offends white kids, it makes them feel bad. When you should kind of be honest about the things that do happen, and that's just beyond crazy. As Phil from This Advice Show said, what would happen if they said, let's remove the Holocaust, how do you think the Jewish community would react? Well, how do you think the Chinese community would react if you removed the rape of Nanking from textbooks? How do you think the Japanese population, Japanese Americans would react if you removed Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombs? But there's also that thing, too, that we kind of see when it comes to Black history and recalling Black figures, that there always seems to be a sense of either grandifying or also tearing them down a bit because of American racism. And then also what Black people want to do, like the Freeman family, like Robert Freeman is really just... is really say, you know what, well, since you're going to have a vision of my ancestors that's not true, that puts them down, I'm going to have a vision of my ancestors that may not be true and put them up, really. So there always has to be a sense of there's always a sense of like argument. And I also kind of like how Huey ends it because he reads a textbook and he says like that Robert's ancestor, you know, that their ancestor was somebody who wrote the first screenplay, and he was actually like somebody who was very like Uncle Tom like because he was educated, and he was actually the son of the slave master, but he got special preferential treatment. And then what happened was there was a rebellion. He accidentally shoots the slave master, and he kind of takes the popular side, so he doesn't be like, oh my god, I just killed like my slave master type of thing. So I do think that you know, like sometimes the truth hurts, but sometimes, you know, like with the truth, it's a little bit better because you kind of accept reality instead of accept fiction. And I was adopted out of a bad situation, so I was kind of like told many different things about my relatives. That, you know, I was told that I came from a pure Black family, like all my family members were Black. And that was like what my adopted parents have said. And I know that I've talked about not wanting to criticize people, but I remember feeling very, very hurt when my parents said that because I'm actually over 50% white and not even 20th Black, but they kind of had that thing too off their own like stereotypes that I come from a pure Black family and all my relatives are Black. And I've actually seen my biological family, actually all of them are white. So it's kind of funny, like how my parents have inaccuracies. I've also remember my my biological aunt saying that that my relatives, some of them served in, you know, World War II, some of them served in the Revolutionary War, a lot of them served in the Battle of Gettysburg. I mean, and Civil War with Ulysses S. Grant. And I remember like one time I got mad and I said on Facebook that actually my relatives were Confederate soldiers. And I think like one of the reasons why I did that was because, you know, I was going through a lot of different emotions, and I kind of almost wanted to make everybody in my family everybody in my family look like I'm in a way worse situation. But my aunt was like, no, that's not true. And then I kind of just said to her, you know, I got into my emotions, and I just, sometimes when I get into my emotions, I say things that are not true to reality. You know, it may not be intentional lying. It may just be my brain remembering things wrong because I want to kind of look at things as extremes. But I kind of told her that, you know, from now on, I have to do my best on not being that person anymore. You know, like I have to kind of go by what is history, what actually happened, because it's also offensive to the relative to be like, okay, they're actually better than you think or worse than you think. And or just putting them in a light that's negative when it's not negative because you're hurting on the inside, you know. So I've definitely have had to learn to just be just more mindful of what I say and be respectful of it. So, you know, I'm definitely learning and growing to be a better person. But, you know, definitely everybody comes from an ancestry, and you will have relatives in your past that have accomplished great things. You'll have relatives that are mediocre. You'll have relatives that are extraordinary people, and you have relatives that are just horrible people. But you always got to be, you know, you always got to like preach the truth about where you came from. And if you know relatives, no matter what, there's always something to learn. And but ultimately, we always have to be accurate. And also too, that just because just because there are people. And racist people really should not diminish or fabricate history the same way people who are looking for heroes should not fabricate history and embellish people, because that's just not cool. And you look at somebody like George Floyd, where like there's a huge story that he had a criminal history, but people like paint him as like a patron saint to black people and other things like that. That's a great example of somebody in the black community who is seen as a martyr for police brutality, but how people just don't look at the bad side. The same way you look at slavery that happened to African Americans, and people are saying, no, black people were never slaves, they were indentured servants, because there's always a sense of diminishing of what black people have gone through. So, I definitely think it's a very important episode about how people look at heritage and they're willing to lie because the truth hurts, but, the truth shall set you free.